Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the what, why, and how of deploying App Engine Studio. So today we're going to discuss how to actually get App Engine Studio into your instances and what that looks like. Before we get started, quick safe harbor notice: in the event that I talk about anything that's forward facing, obviously don't make any purchasing decisions based on that information. Just for your information, today's session is part of the Live on ServiceNow interactive event series, and it's a curated series to connect you with ServiceNow experts like myself and peers that can help you deploy your products. So feel free to scan the link on the screen and see the schedule for other events that are coming. Next up, a little bit of housekeeping. Try to keep all of your questions in the Q&A. If for some reason we're unable to answer your questions live, we will get to them after the session. The presentation is going to be recorded, and that should be shared on the community along with the PowerPoint deck. And then after the event, you will be prompted to fill out a survey. Please fill that out. It helps us to kind of determine what sort of content you're interested in and what helps you and what doesn't. Also, obviously, thank you for joining us today. A little bit about me. So I'm Paige Duffy. I will obviously be the one presenting today. I'm a Principal Product Success Manager here at ServiceNow. I've been here for about a year and a half. Prior to that, I worked as a customer in the ServiceNow ecosystem since about 2009. So I've done a lot of things in that time. I've been an admin, a developer, platform owner, helped put together a citizen development program. You name it, I've probably done a little bit of it. Now I focus on helping to drive the adoption of products that customers own. So things like App Engine Studio, App Engine Management Center. Obviously, as you can see in the expertise, I have a lot of experience with the platform in general, building custom apps, managing dev teams, establishing citizen development programs, all of the above. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about first, what is App Engine Studio, why you want App Engine Studio, what is the value that it brings to your company. Next, we'll get in depth with deploying App Engine Studio, including a short demo on how to deploy App Engine Studio. There will be some key resources at the end, and then, of course, Q&A. So first things first, before we really get started, we have a poll for you. How familiar are you with App Engine Studio? Is it something that you've used? Is it something that you know about but you've not used? You don't know how to maximize its value, or you don't know anything about it? So it looks like we're already getting a lot of responses. It looks like a lot of you know about App Engine Studio but haven't used it, or you've never seen it before. So hopefully we can help educate you on its purposes. There are quite a few YouTube videos out there about it. So, all right. We're still getting a few more responses, so we'll give you guys just a couple more seconds. All right, it looks like it's slowing down, so I think we can go ahead and close the poll. So it does look like the highest percentage have seen it but not used it, followed closely by not having seen it at all. So that's exciting. Alrighty. So first thing, what is App Engine Studio? For those of you that have never experienced it, we're just going to briefly cover what it is. App Engine Studio is basically a low-code visual development environment. It allows users to create, modify, and customize all aspects of applications. So you're talking about creating tables, permissions to tables, experiences, logic and automation to, drive what those tables are supposed to be doing. But all of that is wrapped up in the studio and then wrapped in guardrails. It also allows for the collaboration of others while building that application. And we'll get a little more in depth with that as we go through the next slides. But first, I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by it allows access to all the low-code builders. So App Engine Studio, at a very, very basic level, is a guided wrapper for your low-code builders. So everything that you see on the screen is available in App Engine Studio. But it's not just a collection of builders. It presents those builders in a logical way. So it shows you these different builders in a way that makes them relevant to what you're doing. So table and form builder while you're building data for your application. Process automation designer, decision builder, flow designer while you're building automation and logic for your application. If you've ever used Studio in ServiceNow, you might wonder what the difference between App Engine Studio and ServiceNow Studio is. They are two different environments. Obviously, App Engine Studio, as we discussed, is a low-code development environment, whereas the ServiceNow Studio is an integrated development environment. One is geared more towards that low-code development for either your low-code developers or even your pro-code developers, whereas ServiceNow Studio is really more targeted for your pro-code developers. I know sometimes it may not seem like App Engine Studio is really for those all skills, but App Engine Studio is really good for a starting point for your pro-code developers. So it's a good place to start building your app. And then you can always move over to Studio or outside of either one of those environments to continue working on the app. So you are not restricted to App Engine Studio just because you create the app there. But as you can see in the screenshot, there are a lot of things that they each do separately, and there are a lot of things that they all do together. So both of them can publish to the app repo. Both of them take advantage of all of the different builders. One of the biggest difference between Studio and App Engine Studio, as far as the builders are concerned, is again, App Engine Studio provides you those builders in a logical way, whereas Studio just provides you access to those builders. So next, real quickly, we'll kind of cover the value of App Engine Studio. So above and beyond the fact that it is a nice starting point for your pro-code developers, what about your low-code developers? What value does that bring? So I'm going to throw some numbers at you. Obviously, anytime we start talking about low-code and no-code development, we start talking about citizen development or delegated development. And these are some numbers, obviously, from several different research organizations talking about app development outside of centralized IT. So as you can see here, 451 research found that 82% of firms say custom app development outside of IT is important. Gartner found some similar numbers, that 80% of those will be built outside of IT by 2024. So it's something that is continuing to grow and is expected to continue to grow. But more important than kind of the research numbers are the customers that we have that are seeing actual results. So all of these numbers are from customers that are actively participating in citizen development. The first one, Novant Health. And I can speak a little bit more to that because I was actually involved in creating their citizen development program. But, there was a 41% increase in development capacity after they started bringing in delegated developers. So you went from a giant backlog that was never shrinking to a significant amount of that being taken on by those delegated developers. For Jabil, they saved around 4,600 hours just by automating processes using their citizen development program. And then Banco do Brasil, Obviously, they have about 1,200 citizen developers right now. They have a goal to get about 10,000 citizen developers in total. And they have 90,000 employees. So that's a good, well, it's more than 10%. I'm bad at math on the fly, but it's quite a few citizen developers for the size of the organization. So it's kind of some of the value behind App Engine Studio. So why you want to implement it. But let's really get into the meat of the discussion. How we deploy it. Before we get into talking about the deployment of App Engine Studio, we do have one more poll, which is, do you plan to install App Engine Studio? And here we're really looking to see if you've already got it installed or what your plans are to install it in the next 6 months to a year, or whether you're not going to install it at all. So as the numbers are coming in, it actually looks like quite a few have already got it installed. So it'll be interesting to see. We'll talk a little bit more about not just installing it, but the steps to take to actually get it ready for use. So hopefully that'll be relevant to everyone. Give you just a couple more minutes to finish out that poll. All right, it looks like the answers have slowed down, so we can probably go ahead and close that out. Just as a recap, so yeah, most of you, almost 50% have already installed it. A good portion of you plan to install it, and a few of you don't want to install it at all. So some of the first steps to deploying App Engine Studio, so not the actual installation, but deploying it, is deciding how you're going to use it. And this is kind of a valid step for all custom app creation. But before you start creating those apps and before you start delegating out the creation of those apps, you should really have a defined application life cycle. And that is all the way from the very start. So how are you going to intake those new apps? How are you going to determine if an app actually belongs in ServiceNow? How are you going to determine if an app already exists in ServiceNow? That's your intake step, and it's really important to, helping with that app sprawl that we often see anytime you start giving people the option to create whatever they want. So this really helps with the governance around app sprawl. Next, obviously, is build, and that is really where AES is going to shine. But while building an app, one thing to keep in mind is how to support the people building an app, especially if those individuals are not part of your core team. So if you are extending out into delegated or citizen development, how are you going to support them? Next is the validation of those apps. What are your plans to validate them? This may follow along the same lines as your normal validation for any of the things that you put into ServiceNow, any of the enhancements or defects that you're fixing. But it is important to understand how you want to do that validation. Are you looking to use automation, things like instant scan, ATF? Is there some manual testing that's required? And how are you going to track that validation? Next is the deployment method. How are those apps going to be deployed? Do they have to follow a regular release cycle? What does that look like? And of course, the maintenance of those apps. So once the apps are deployed, who's going to maintain them? Again, this is especially important if you're doing something like citizen development. You want to establish who's responsible for the maintenance and support of that app before it goes into production. You don't want to try and do it on the fly as incidents are starting to come in. Next is really the monitoring of the health of the app. we'll very briefly cover some stuff that you can install through AEMC that helps with the monitoring of the app, but you want to know that that app is being used. And then if that app is not being used, you want to know when it's time to retire it. Some applications have a short life cycle. You're only intending to use them for a period of time. We probably saw a lot of that during COVID, apps that were only going to be used for a period of time. So knowing when it's time to remove that application or retire that application is equally important. You don't want to leave a bunch of technical debt on your platform. Once you have defined your application lifecycle, you really kind of want to define your instance strategy. You may find that your instance strategy for App Engine Studio is the exact same as your instance strategy for any other app or any other thing on your instance. It may also be different. I know in my experience, we had our citizen developers on a different development instance. So you may have a pipeline that's a little bit different for your App Engine Studio apps. So it's just important to know what that looks like for your environment. One other thing to note on here, well, obviously in the image, we have App Engine Studio in development. That is where all the work is done in App Engine Studio, but it is equally important to go ahead and install it on production, not for use in production, but for clone downs. So you don't have to reinstall everything after a clone. All right, so I wanted to show this image real quick. We're not going to go too far into this because we're going to cover part of this in a live demo here in just a couple of minutes. But this is a really good high-level overguide of the different steps to installing AES, AEMC, which is the App Engine Management Center, as well as pipelines and application intake. All four of those are different apps, but they all come together to provide governance with your system. And then one last thing before we get to the demo. So this looks obviously a lot like our application lifecycle slide, back a few slides. The thing I wanted to note here, is that each of these steps in that application lifecycle, we do provide out of the box plugins or applications that help support those. So obviously, again, we're really focusing a lot on the build today, which is AES, but we do have application intake, which covers that intake portion, and App Engine Management Center, which helps to cover the monitoring, retiring, and then pipelines for deployment and validation. And again, if you look back at this slide, each one of these boxes covers a different one of those applications. So again, they all work together to kind of provide that seamless end-to-end governance for those applications. Right. So I am going to switch over to a live demo. So give me just a second. And while I do that, there was a question that came in about the presentation and whether or not it'll be available for replay or will the deck be shared. Yes, it will be out on the community. I believe that link might already be in the chat. Alrighty. So the first step is obviously actually installing App Engine Studio. If your instances are entitled for it, going into the application manager, and this is the application manager as of Vancouver. If you are on an older version, it may look a little bit different, but when you search for App Engine Studio, you should either get a product like this, or if you're in the older version, you'll want to scroll down quite a bit until you get the one that involves all of the applications. You do want to make sure that you install that as a package. The reason being, there are quite a few plugins involved in this application, and you do not want to have to install them each individually if you do not have to. One thing that is important to note as far as what's being installed as part of this, the application intake plugin is being installed and the development pipelines plugins are being installed. App Engine Management Center does not get installed as part of the AES bundle, but they do all work together. All right, so I have actually already installed AES because if I hadn't, we would be sitting here waiting for that to install for pretty much the entire presentation. It's a lot of plugins. So there are guided setups for every step of the installation or deployment of App Engine Studio. Obviously, installing it, very, very easy. Once you get it installed, though, you basically follow these guided setups in the order that they're presented in your application menu. So we start right here, which is the screen. It will guide you through everything that you need to do to actually configure it, including connecting spokes so that you can use that to communicate with individuals that are either part of your admin group or your developers, reviewing Flow Designer access. So while most access for app creation is controlled within AES itself, access for Flow Designer and catalog, service catalog builder can be configured separately. You can configure general access to Flow Designer and general access to the builder within AES, but for more nuanced control, say, I don't want people to be able to create subflows, but I want them to be able to create flows. You will have to do that separately, and it does walk you through that in this step here and this step here. Next is going through health scans. So through the pipelines application that again is included when you install AES, you can automatically run instant scans, but you do have to configure what you want that instant scan to do. And so once you've configured all of these steps, you move into the next one, which is setting up user access. So here, you're setting up the administrator group, which already exists. You're just adding individuals to it. What those administrators do is they receive notifications for application development. This becomes even more important if you do set up AEMC in production. You'll want those group members in production, not necessarily in your sub-production, but they're going to be the individuals that approve the app intake requests that come in. So I want to create a new app. The individuals that approve them to move forward when a deployment request is submitted through AES. So I've completed my app. I'm submitting it. Now a deployment request is created in production. Those individuals are the people who approve that and help it move forward. Next, we're configuring permissions for your existing developers. So individuals who you already want to have access, you do not necessarily have to have them go create, an intake. You can just go ahead and give them access here. And then down here, we're talking about the same thing as far as access to App Engine Studio. There are two types of access for App Engine Studio. The first is full access, which means they can create apps. If they have that group, they can go create their own apps. That does not mean that they can go into someone else's app and start doing work if they're not granted access to it, but they can create any apps that they want. Whereas the limited access users can only work on apps that they've been granted access to. They cannot create new ones of their own. Last is something called collaboration descriptors. These are what control the permissions for your individual users. So obviously we have the groups up here. That is just controlling access to whether or not you can create an app on your own. The collaboration descriptors are what are actually controlling the amount of access that they have. Out of the box, we provide two collaboration descriptors, which is owner and editor. Owner are the people that obviously create the app and can do just about anything within the app. Editors can only edit the app. You can also create your own though. And so when you're creating your own, and again, the guided setup takes you through all of this, but when you're creating your own, you can name it whatever you want. You can determine whether or not you want that to be standard, and then you give it the permissions that you want this particular descriptor to have. I want them to be able to create, service portals, invite collaborators, do workflows and workflow designer, etc. Now, again, when you grant them workflow access or flow designer access, if there's no nuanced controls like we talked about just a few minutes ago, that grants them full access to Flow Designer. If you want to control that a little more specifically, you do have to follow the steps up here in reviewing Flow Designer Access. There is some documentation on how to create these collaborators. So I won't get too deep into it because I could probably spend another 30 minutes explaining how to create those. So that is the basics of App Engine Studio. If you just do this, it will work. It'll definitely work. But you do lose out on a few things. Some of the automation that's available through things like pipelines and then the application intake. So when you're setting up pipelines, that is basically the automation that allows you to go into App Engine Studio, say my app is done, click submit, and then it starts to do things. It will create a deployment request in production that'll get approved. Once that's approved, it goes up the pipeline that you've set up and it moves into the next sub-production instance. It can run things like ATF and instant scan automatically. And then it continues to move up from there into production. Again, we won't get too in-depth with this because there's a lot of information here, but there's some really good training. And in fact, I don't have a timeline, but there will be some new training out on Now Learning in the near future that takes you through exactly how to set all of this up. But as you can see, there are a lot of steps. Some important things here is that you do configure your production instance differently than your test instance, differently from all of your other sub-production instances. And this just helps when you're creating the pipeline, the order of events. It helps all of your instances do what they're supposed to be doing correctly. The last thing is the application intake. So this is that intake step on your application lifecycle. It includes a catalog item and again, does some automation. So when these items are input and accepted, it will automatically go and provision the permissions that you define for that user. And so we'll kind of take a quick look at what that item looks like. Obviously, this is from the admin's point of view. Oh, well, it's not going to let me pull that up. Sorry about that. I did not have this particular item prepared in advance. But I bet we can do a preview. There we go. While this is loading, I do see another question I can answer pretty quickly. AES, is it scoped for scoped apps only or global too? Does it support working on legacy scoped apps and also legacy global functionality? It is only for scoped apps. You cannot do global or global scoped work in AES. So now you can create a scoped app that sits kind of on top of an ITSM function and allow access to that and modifications in that. You do get a little bit of a hiccup with some cross-scope privileges. But as far as just going into global scope and doing things, it does not support that. So here's just a preview of what that item looks like. There are some things that you can configure in this. Down here is what the administrators see. So your end users who are putting this in do not actually see this. But if I were approving this, if it were actually, one that was submitted from here, I'd have my development instances that I set up in the pipeline to pick from. And I would tell them what type of permissions I want to give them. So the create edit goes back to what I said before. You have a group where they can create and edit applications that they have access to, or they can only edit specific applications that they have access to, or you're going to manually configure them, in which case there will be no automation. So this item lives in production. It does use, again, those pipelines, and it uses Flow to communicate with your development instances and will automatically provision those users into the group. So again, there's a couple of tasks that you do here. Activating the catalog item, setting up, again, the administrators in the group. This particular one, you don't necessarily have to do this in production, but this is something that lives in production, whereas AAS and most of that configuration lives in dev. Again, good idea to bring it into production so that you don't have to redo this, but nobody's going to be doing work in AES in production, whereas this catalog item lives and works in production. So, and then next, again, it's taking you to create those development environments because it can be used without fully setting up your pipelines. You can just set up the development environments if you don't want to set up your pipelines. But either way, whatever you set up either in pipelines or through here and mark as development instances, they're going to show up on that dropdown that we just saw. So that's kind of the basics of it. I don't want to say that's all there is to it, but that's kind of all there is to it. Once you've done all of that, you have access to App Engine Studio. You can go and get started. From there, they can create their apps. They can access apps that they've created. And then from there, add experiences and things of that nature. And like I said earlier in the presentation, each of these kind of opens in a builder. And this is what I meant by it takes those builders and it presents them in a logical way. So you don't have to know what builder you need. You just have to know, hey, I need to add data. What kind of data am I adding? And you can do so from there, and it will open up the builder that's relevant to what activity you're trying to do. So I won't get too far into that so that we leave plenty of time for any additional questions. But that is pretty much the basics of how to install App Engine Studio. At the end of the presentation, the deck that will be shared, there is, and I will actually go ahead and pull that back up, but there is some resources so that you can access some links that walk you through step by step by step how to do the installation, how to set it up, how to use it. Let me bring this back up. I'll skip to that real quick just so I can show you. So right here, that very first one underneath Technical App Engine Studio System Administrator Guide, that is going to walk you through all the things that I just talked to you about, only it's going to do it in depth, every step of the way, exactly what it's doing. You will also see some very similar diagrams to what you saw in this presentation. So, all right, that is the demo. We do have one more poll. For those of you that have either not installed App Engine Studio, or you have installed it but you're not using it, what challenges have prevented you from using it? And while I will likely not be able to solve any of those challenges on this call, it does help us to know what kind of conversations we need to start having in the future. So. Alrighty, it looks like it's slowing down. We can probably go ahead and shut down the poll and share those results. So it does look like the vast majority of it's just not been enough time to learn the tool. On that note, there are a lot of really good videos out there on how to use the tool. Hopefully, for the most part, it's easy enough that you know it should be pretty quick to learn it. I will tell you, if there are any of you on here who are pro developers, the best way that I found to learn the tool was just to use it. So the next time I wanted to create an app, I created it in App Engine Studio. It also helped me learn all the pain points. So all the things I couldn't do as a low-code developer, and all the things I could do was the way that I learned the tool. So I have one more slide for you here before we get to Q&A. And this is just a quick slide for a screenshot. It kind of just covers the high points that we covered today without you having to take a bunch of notes. So, and again, this deck will also be available after the presentation. All right. One more thing before we get to Q&A. So just a couple of ways to kind of accelerate value and further goals, some more resources, obviously around ServiceNow Impact, the training and certification. So some really good information there on, kind of how to upskill, what training is good, and how to use that. And then of course, expert services. So yeah, thank you again for joining me, and certainly let us know if you have any more questions.